Welcome to BRG's ThinkSet podcast. I'm your host, Michael Whalen. BRG is a global consulting firm. We help organizations in disputes and investigations, corporate finance, and performance improvement and advisory. We're a multidisciplined group of experts, industry leaders, academics, data scientists, and professionals. Around the world, BRG delivers the inspired insights and practical strengths our clients need to stay ahead of what's next. For more information about BRG, please visit thinkbrg.com. In this episode of the ThinkSet podcast, we're talking about the gig economy. It's a contractor-based work model that was accelerated by apps such as Uber, Lyft, Postmates, Instacart, and DoorDash. These apps offered network platforms for ride-sharing, deliveries, and odd jobs. Surprisingly, the assault on work flexibility made possible by such technological innovations has been most concentrated in California, the home of Silicon Valley and much of the tech sector. Last year, California passed a new law, generally called AB 5, that aims to reclassify many gig economy independent contractors as employees. We're talking to BRG expert David Lewin, who has been at the forefront of the analysis of the implications of AB 5 and of the voter initiative to modify it. In addition to heading up BRG's human capital practice from his home base in Los Angeles, Dr. Lewin is the Neil H. Jacoby Professor Emeritus of Management, Human Resources, and Organizational Behavior at the UCLA Anderson School of Management. David, thank you for joining the ThinkSet podcast to talk about these complex issues.
Happy to do so.
So, David, how did AB 5 change the classification of contractors and employees?
Well, AB 5 doesn't change the classification of employees. It potentially changes the classification of contractors to employees. And that is, in essence, its intent.
And was this a big change? Because I understand that the California Supreme Court had already reinterpreted traditional worker classification, putting a greater burden on companies to demonstrate that contractors were not employees.
Well, that's correct, Michael. In 2018, in a decision that's popularly known as the Dynamex decision, the California Supreme Court came up with a new three-factor test for companies, and for that matter, other organizations, such as nonprofits, to determine whether independent contractors are in fact independent. And that three-factor test has popularly become known as the ABC test. The second factor, the B factor, is the one that has attracted the bulk of attention from companies and other employers because it basically says that an independent contractor must be doing work that is distinctly different from the work done by the company for which it is providing services. Most contractors are doing work that is very similar to the basic work that a company is doing. So most employers believe that they could not meet just the B part of the new ABC test. The legislature then came along the next year in 2019 in the proposed AB 5 and passed it. And Governor Newsom signed it into law in September. And so it sought a legislative solution, in quotes, to this matter, so it wouldn't be just left to the courts to decide on a case-by-case basis.
So that seems like a very big change in terms of a contractor has to do work which is different from the type of work that your company performs. I mean, that would seem to sweep up a lot of people who do freelance or other type of work for hire.
Well, I think that's basically correct because if you're having a contractor perform services for your company, they have to be services in connection with the goods or services your company is providing. So, yes, it would be a very large change indeed if, in fact, actually implemented. Most, if not all, contractors under the three-factor test, the ABC test, would, in essence, have to become employees.
Do we have a sense of who's been affected by this change? I mean, how big is this gig economy?
That's two questions, and I'm going to try my best to answer both of them. Who is affected by the change? Let's take that one first. AB 5, to me, is as or more notable for what it refers to as carve-outs We used to call these exemptions, but now the language is carve outs, meaning occupations to which AB 5 does not apply. And these are, in fact, much bigger in terms of occupations and industries than the gig economy. So, for example, all physicians are excluded, all attorneys are excluded. Basically, accountants are excluded. All of the people in occupations associated with the provision of business services are excluded. But so too are salon workers. So too are tow truck drivers. And the list goes on and on. What this tells us is that the law is basically aimed at the so called gig economy. And therefore, its impact, if in fact the contractors become employees, could be very large for the gig economy, but not particularly elsewhere.
When I listen to people advocate in a number of matters in court, particularly issues of regulatory authority or issues of constitutional question, there's always this discussion of, well, what's the underlying distinguishing principle here? So if so many people are carved out of the reach of this new approach on reclassification, what is actually the distinguishing principle?
I don't think there is an underlying principle, except if you believe that the objective of AB 5 is to increase revenue flowing to the state of California. And that is clearly what the state itself believes will be the result of AB 5, because various agencies in the state for the last several years have been making claims about, quote, lost revenue, unquote, and there the focus is on payroll tax revenue. The argument is contractors are not covered by payroll taxes. If they were employees, the employers would have to pay payroll taxes, and to some extent, so would the employees. And that revenue would flow to the state of California, in particular to its general fund. So if one is looking for a principle here, it's basically an argument that this change, if it happens, is going to increase the revenue, tax revenue, to the state of California.
Was that the explicit basis and the explicit objective of AB 5? And if so, did it have a target in mind?
I think that it's definitely the objective of AB 5, yes. Did it have a target in mind is a very interesting question. And about that, I can say the following. When we began our work on this matter over a year ago, we started with a claim made by the state of California, by its budget office, by the Employee Development Department, and other units of the state government, that California was losing $7 billion a year because contractors weren't covered by payroll taxes. So we did a bunch of sleuthing, kind of a bit of detective work to try to find out where did this $7 billion come from. And we talked with all of the agencies in California. We went through a whole variety of documents. We couldn't find anything. Eventually, we did find what we were looking for. It turns out that in 2012, so that is 8 years ago, a report was put out by a commission that was actually appointed in the Obama administration to look at independent contracting. Ironically, that commission was headed by one Joe Biden. The report of the commission says that the nation, not California alone, but the nation, loses $7 billion, but not annually, but rather over a 10-year period, because contractors don't pay payroll taxes. And they covered all contractors, not just drivers for rideshare and delivery companies or contractors in the high-tech area or the gig economy, but all people providing contracting services. You can appreciate what that might mean, because almost all of the insurance agents in this country are independent contractors. Most of the equipment installers for cable and satellite companies are independent contractors, and so on. So when we took that apart, the actual loss to the state of California annually because of independent contracting, if it's not zero, it's pretty close. That $7 billion, therefore, has no basis in fact or in empirical evidence.
So the $7 billion seems to have been calculated on a number which was a nationwide estimate, was over a decade, and was for a broader class of people than affected by AB5. But tell me a little bit more about what you think the real fiscal impact might be and how you came about determining that.
In our work, our analytical work, we developed two models aimed at determining what would be the revenue flow on an annual basis to the state of California from contracting versus employment. In other words, the current contracting arrangement versus the proposed employment arrangement. And those two models differed in only one respect. In the first model, we assumed that 1/3 of the currently working independent contractors would not be converted to employment because that would be too costly for the companies. In the second model, our percentage was 50%. Our estimates under those two models are that relative to employment, the state would gain about $91 million annually from the independent contractor arrangement over the employment arrangement. And under the second model, about $111 million a year relative independent contractor to employment. So our analysis indicates that the state will do better, actually, by keeping this independent contractor arrangement than it would switching to an employment arrangement. And the main reason there is that these companies simply will not employ anything close to the number of people who currently do driving for them, whether they're rideshare companies or food delivery companies. In 2018, the last year for which we had complete data, there were more than 1 million Californians, just Californians, no other state, who drove to some extent for the rideshare and food delivery companies. If we follow the business models of those companies, which we discuss extensively in our report, the percentage of drivers who would be employed is smaller than 1/3 and smaller than 50%. Our best estimate is it's in the 10 to 20% range. That means that about 80 to 90% of the people who currently drive for these companies would no longer do so because the companies would find it too expensive for them to employ them on a regular basis. So that gives you some sense of the fiscal implications of AB5, and you can compare our 91 million or $111 million annual estimate on the positive side to the state's claim of a negative 7 billion. I mean, we're not close here at all.
What would the broader economic impacts be in addition to those strictly to California's general fund?
The broader implications are several. Probably the most notable would be a decline in consumer demand for rideshare and food delivery services because the prices of those services would inevitably have to rise under an employment model. We estimate for the rideshare companies that increase would be in the neighborhood of 32%, and for the food delivery companies in the neighborhood of 25%. So basic microeconomic analysis tells you when you get a price increase, the demand declines. And with those magnitudes of price increases, the demands could decline very substantially. People who used to use Uber or DoorDash for rideshare and or food delivery respectively some of them will now look for alternatives given higher prices. Another impact is that the companies would concentrate more on providing these services in high density urban areas, which would make more economic sense, than in outlying and rural areas. So, folks in the suburbs and especially in rural areas would have much less availability of the rideshare and the food delivery services. And then, everything else equal, which it never is, there would also likely be increased waiting time to get a driver to take you somewhere or to deliver your food because now fewer drivers would be employed. So these are amongst the likely consequences of the implementation, the actual implementation of AB5 in the gig economy.
David, I understand the analysis you did was on behalf of some of the companies most affected by the legislation. These would be the app providers, the ones who are providing the rideshare and door delivery services. So, what has been the reaction of supporters of the legislation to this analysis?
Well, we were initially approached by a set of public relations and law firms that had DoorDash as its only client for what was termed a coalition to focus on this issue. DoorDash was later joined by Uber, Lyft, Instacart, and Postmates. So the Protect App Based Services and Drivers Committee, which is our client in this matter, included those 5 companies. We accepted the assignment only under the condition that our analysis, our findings, and our conclusions would be done independently, as is all of our work at BRG. Now, the folks who are working with the coalition as their public relations firm and their law firm, they then wanted to pursue an initiative, if it could be reached with a sufficient number of signatures, to put a proposition on the California ballot. So they have done all of that work to get what is now Proposition 22 on the California ballot to be voted on by Californians next month. And that measure, stripping away whatever language you find in your voter advice pamphlets or other documents, basically is a proposition that says if you vote yes, it'll preserve the independent contractor relationship. If you vote no, it won't.
Was there a large outcry for AB5 by independent contractors who were engaged in the gig economy?
I'll give you a couple of statistics that may be germane. In 2017, I think it was, possibly 2018, and we cite their work, the US Department of Labor conducted a survey of a random sample of independent contractors across all major industries in the United States. Their main conclusion was that 79% of the contractors preferred to remain contractors. And of the remaining 21%, a little under 10% said they preferred employment, and the others said they didn't know or it depends. That's a pretty substantial finding on this matter. We have other data from surveys of drivers for these gig companies, and the very large percentages say that they want to remain independent contractors. And if one asks, well, why is it that they, in the main, with some exceptions, of course, prefer not to be employees? The answers run like this. Flexibility is the first thing. And one might say, well, flexibility or autonomy, maybe that's a buzzword. About 40% of the drivers for these gig economy companies hold other full time jobs. That is not widely known. About another 25% hold part time jobs. That is not widely known. Of the remainder, call it roughly 30%, about half are students looking to earn money when they're not going to class or studying so they can pay off their loans, pay their tuitions, and all that stuff. The other half of that 30% are retirees. And these retirees typically are receiving a pension payment from prior employment, but it's not enough to cover their expenses, especially since these days, lots of retirees either have their kids at home or who have returned home and they have to pay for them, or they are caring for their parents who are still alive under the increased aging of the US population. So, when you consider the larger picture, this business of driving for one of these app based companies that provides flexibility, that provides autonomy, you can work when you want, you can decline the work. That's not a throwaway. That is a real live factor and is obviously very important.
David, I thought it would have been a shock for a lot of people who prefer the flexibility of choosing their hours and deciding what kind of work they want to do to be classified as traditional employees, in which they would potentially lose control over work flexibility and their ability to decline certain types of work. So, what's your sense of the reaction of workers to this reclassification?
That is a really interesting question. I'll give you two experiences that we've had this century so far. In one involving a package delivery company, a group of drivers, delivery drivers for that company, filed suit claiming that they should be reclassified from independent contractors to employees. When we analyzed the data involving that matter, we found that the company very highly controlled the work of those drivers, from determining what went into the trucks for them to deliver, to when they should deliver, to the routes they should use in delivery, to being supervised closely by terminal managers who are in effect their supervisors, to having their performance evaluated carefully, just like you would find in many employment situations. They had little to no autonomy or flexibility in their work. And the decisions of the courts since we began working on this matter years ago increasingly have required that particular company to reclassify those contractors as employees. More recently, for another company that is in the transportation business, mainly taking people to and from airports, there was a lawsuit similar to the first matter filed by a set of drivers who also claimed that they should be reclassified as employees. But in that matter, we analyzed terabytes on the driver's use of their vans, and we analyzed GPS data, global positioning system data. And what we found was the drivers could decide what routes they wanted to use. They didn't have to use prescribed routes. They could turn off their communications devices with dispatch. They could turn down jobs from dispatch. They didn't have to take them. And that's pretty unusual in that industry. They could hire sub drivers. They could use their vans for other purposes. In other words, the first example was one of high control by the company. The second example was low control by the company and high control by the drivers. Here in our independent contractor drivers for the rideshare and gig economy companies, I've already mentioned a majority of them work also for other companies, but I didn't mention that any number of them use the apps from two or three of these companies to drive for them. They have the flexibility not only of deciding to accept a job or turn it down and decide what route, but they can do that for more than one company. In an employment situation, you either can't do that or you can rarely do that. So this is low company control over the basic driver's decision on whether to work or not, and how often to work, and for whom to work.
Has the pandemic had any impact on public reaction to AB5 or Proposition 22, particularly since there seems to have been an uptick in activity of delivery platforms?
You know that there are more than 30 million employees, and that's probably a large undercount, who have lost their jobs just in the 7 months of this pandemic. That's employees. If you're an independent contractor, depending upon what company and industry you work for, you might have fewer driving opportunities than you did before the pandemic, but you might have more than you had before the pandemic. Just think to yourself of delivery companies and think to yourself of package companies. The impacts of COVID 19 are very substantially negative on employment when taken as a whole. In that comparative view, the independent contracting arrangement is, I think, a far preferable one.
So often, when new elements of technology or culture or politics emerge in California, there's the inevitable question as to whether this is going to be a pattern that's exported to other states. But I am aware as well that there has been some similar legislation in Massachusetts since 1990. What's your sense on this? Is this going to be a wave of reclassification legislation efforts across the country, or is this something which is going to have a narrower impact than might be suggested by what's happened so far in California?
Right. And another way to ask the question that builds on your question is, can you envision the US Congress contemplating and enacting an AB5?
Mm.
So far, no one has said anything about that. But it's a logical extension of the question you asked, because after all, the Congress passed the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, when prior to that time, nobody thought that was ever possible. The Congress passed the Occupational Safety and Health Act in 1970. No one ever thought that was possible. And subsequent legislation, not to mention the Civil Rights Act, ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, or the Workers with Disability Act. So things are oftentimes difficult to predict on a national scale, let alone a state by state basis. This legislation is also being considered in New Jersey. It's being considered in Illinois, usually the larger states. And it's not being considered, at least at present, to the best of my knowledge, in a pretty substantial majority of the states. On the company side, one has to be careful if a single state like California does something with respect to a company that operates nationally or internationally. Now, the Ubers of the world, the Lyfts of the world, the Instacarts of the world, they've been in existence for a short time. They are not yet profitable. So their business models are designed to generate profitability. What company's business model wouldn't be? But at almost a decade into it now, or more for some of these companies, profitability is still an elusive goal. So if your costs rise in one portion of the country, your tendency would be to move away from that area and move to others. We saw this over decades in the automobile industry, where the production moved from the Northeast, moved from California, moved from the Midwest, especially, to the South. So this is a fundamentally important consideration, looking to something like Proposition 22 and looking more fundamentally at something like AB5.
And how have companies outside of California reacted to this?
Well, they're not rushing to set up business in California. I think one could say that. But, there are various regulations, a combination of state and federal, that affect companies' decisions about where to situate their business. One development within California, which you probably know well, is that more and more of another set of gig economy company people, and these are mostly employees working for the Googles of the world and the Intels of the world and the many other companies we could say, are, in light of the pandemic, moving out of high-cost, high-rent areas like San Francisco to the suburbs and to rural areas. And you asked before about the impacts of COVID. One of the big ones on employees and companies is both have learned that there is a lot of work that doesn't have to be done in a central location or an office building. And thus, if you can work from home, do you have to be in a high rent, high cost area, or can move somewhere else where the costs are more moderate? And that is going on right now in California. If you extend that kind of thing nationally, you can see similar kinds of behavior.
From a standpoint of a prospective client of BRG's, what would you think the course of action is right now in thinking about the implication of AB5 or similar legislation that might be contemplated elsewhere?
Well, I think I would go back to a question you asked earlier about control. You're a company that provides workers, whether it's independent contractors or employees, some autonomy or flexibility in their work, including where they can work. Then you can't be taken to task for being a highly controlling company in which only the employment model supposedly fits. The independent contracting model can fit those companies potentially much better. And the big growth nationally during this century, this is 20 years now, has been in independent contracting. I mentioned before that insurance agents, equipment installers, and many others are independent contractors. The same with beauty salons, the same with many other kinds of businesses. Most of these businesses could not be viable if they didn't have the independent contractor arrangement. If they are viable, they produce more goods and services. When you do that, the prices come down, more people can demand those services, including people who are relatively low on the income scale. So there are aspects of this matter that have to do not just with employment versus contracting, but with equity for businesses and equity for low-income folks and so on.
That's fascinating. And given the fact that we're all, to a certain extent, working more independently and working remotely, it'll be interesting to see if those who otherwise would have preferred the parameters of a traditional employer-employee relationship might be willing to consider other work models.
Let me add one final thought about this. The traditional employment model, which is so strongly reflected in most of our existing legislation, nationally and statewise, was based on the practice that developed over a 40-year period from roughly 1940 to 1980. That's a fairly short period in the history of the country. That was the permanent employment period. You went to work for a company, usually a man, you had a job, whether an operative or an assembler or a supervisor or an executive, you had a defined benefit pension plan. You could work for that company for your career, unless you screwed up badly. And when you were done with that career, you got a payment, a defined benefit payment every month. And beginning in 1980, when we had the start of the triple revolution of a greatly expanded global economic competition, deregulation, and rapidly increased technological change, most of the industries in the country, which had been oligopolies or monopolies in technical terms, became competitive. Now, being competitive sounds like a good thing in many respects, but it increases your risk. Beginning in the 1980s, IBM and Kodak, to think of two examples of the best known permanent employment companies, began reductions in force and layoffs. And these mushroomed during the rest of that decade and then in subsequent decades. The defined benefit pension plans were largely replaced by 401k plans, which is basically your money that you want to defer. All of this represented a secular shift in risk bearing from employer to employee, or from the company to the people providing the work. And there's not an enemy in this that you can point to. It's the effects of competition. So that today, the old employment model is one under which tens of millions of people are still employed, not permanently by any means. But if so, if they're lucky, they have a 401k plan, not a defined benefit plan. And millions of people are working as independent contractors. And so we tend to be anchored to past practices because they provide stability and a benchmark. And those are good things. But the changes that we're undergoing have really turned that old arrangement, if not fully on its head, then about halfway there at least. And that is in part what's being played out here in Prop 22 and the matter we've been discussing today on independent contracting versus employment.
Well, David, thank you very much for joining us here on BRG's ThinkSet podcast. Fascinating conversation. It'll be interesting to see what voters decide in November on this matter. And thank you for sharing your analysis.
Thank you very much. And just to be clear, I have not placed a bet on the outcome of Proposition 22.
Very good.
All
Thanks
right.
very much.
Thank you.
This ThinkSet podcast is brought to you by BRG. You can subscribe to the podcast and access other content from ThinkSet Magazine by going to thinksetmag.com. Don't forget to rate and review this show on iTunes as well. I'm Michael Whalen. Thanks for listening. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the opinions, position, or policy of Berkeley Research Group or its other employees and affiliates.